Welcome in, everyone. We're doing a deep dive today into the Asian financial crisis back in '97, that year that really shook up the global economy. And you sent in some really fascinating excerpts from an essay that analyzes the whole thing. And I gotta say, this story, it really makes you think about how these seemingly small events, they can spiral out of control and lead to these massive global crises, like that butterfly effect thing, you know?
Definitely. And it's interesting because what makes this crisis so fascinating is that it really makes you question like cause and effect in these giant complex systems. I mean, we're talking global finance here. Yeah. And it wasn't just one thing, right? It was like this perfect storm of different things that came together.
Okay, so let's break down this perfect storm, right? The essay, it really focuses on the summer of 1997 in Thailand. So take us back there. Like, what was going on? Were there any signs that things were about to go south?
So on the surface, right, Southeast Asian economies, they seem to be, booming, doing great. But if you kind of look a little closer, you'd see this huge dependence on debt. And not just any debt. A lot of it was like foreign currency debt. You know, it's kind of like think of it like building a really impressive house, but on a really shaky foundation.
Right. It might look good from far away, but it wouldn't take much to knock it all down.
Exactly. And that whole like vulnerability thing, it all kind of came crashing down in July of '97.
Okay, so July '97, what was the trigger? What happened?
It started with the Thai government. They decided to devalue their currency, the baht. And at first it seemed like a localized thing, just a Thailand problem. But then it set off this domino effect across all of Southeast Asia.
Wow. So how did this one decision, this one thing in Thailand, how did it turn into this huge regional crisis? Like what were the key things at play here?
Well, the essay, it points to a few things. First, you had those shaky economies we were talking about, right? Yeah. Ones built on tons of debt and these banking systems that weren't all that strong, so they were really vulnerable to anything bad happening.
Right, makes sense. And then on top of that, you had all these international investors, right? They were watching all of this unfold. I'm guessing they probably didn't exactly help the situation.
No, not at all. They had been pouring money into these emerging markets, trying to get those, high returns. But then the second they saw trouble, boom, they pulled out just as fast as they came in. Mm. It was basically like a run on the bank, but on a massive scale.
Wow. Okay, so you have these fragile economies, and you have spooked investors hitting the eject button. And if I'm reading this essay right, there's another piece to this puzzle. Something about the relationships between like governments, banks, and big corporations.
Exactly. Yeah, that's where this whole crony capitalism thing comes in. The essay argues that in some of these Southeast Asian countries, the lines between those groups, the governments, banks, corporations, they were way too blurry. We're talking like favors, lack of transparency, and this whole environment where problems could just be hidden because nobody was really watching or holding anyone accountable.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster, to put it lightly. You had all these things coming together in this very specific way.
It really was like a recipe for disaster. And this is where things get even more complicated. Yeah. Because as this whole crisis is unfolding, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, they come in and try to like throw a lifeline to these economies that are, really struggling.
Right. The IMF, they're like what, the global financial first responders or something? But I'm guessing their help didn't come completely free, right?
Yeah, you could say that. The essay spends a lot of time on the IMF. And it really shows how tricky it is when you have these international groups stepping in. So on the one hand, they give these huge bailout packages to countries like Indonesia, South Korea. But these bailouts, they came with some pretty serious strings attached.
Right. Those austerity measures. We hear about those a lot, but what do they actually mean for people on the ground?
Basically, austerity meant these huge cuts in government spending, like they'd slash infrastructure projects, jack up interest rates, sometimes even cut back on things like social programs. The idea was to like stabilize things and make the markets feel better.
Makes sense on paper, I guess. But the essay you shared, it seemed to suggest that these measures, even if they were well-intentioned, they might have actually made some of the problems worse.
Yeah, that's a big part of the debate, right?
Yeah.
So the IMF getting involved, it probably did prevent things from totally imploding. But the essay makes this point that those austerity measures, they cause a lot of social unrest. Imagine, right? You're being told to tighten your belt while your own government is cutting back on essential services. Unemployment goes up, businesses shut down. It was this awful cycle.
Man, what a mess. And the essay really doesn't hold back, does it? It asks those tough questions. Was there another way? Could the IMF have helped without making that social unrest even worse?
It's really interesting. The essay's point seems to be that this whole debate, it shows how important it is to really get how these interventions, even when they're needed, how they affect everyday people.
Error.
It reminds us that economics and politics and just like social realities, they're all tangled up together. There's no easy answers, is there?
Definitely not. So what happened after all that? Did those economies, did they eventually recover? And how did this whole Asian financial crisis, how did it change things globally when it comes to, finance?
Well, getting back on track, it was a long process and rough. But there were some big shifts. A lot of these countries, South Korea is a good example, they used this crisis to make some fundamental changes.
So they took this disaster and found a way to hit the reset button.
Exactly. They put in tougher rules about finance, to prevent that kind of crazy lending and borrowing that led to the crisis in the first place.
Right, right. And what about that lack of transparency, that whole thing we were talking about before with governments and corporations being way too cozy?
They tackled that too. A lot of countries, they made changes to make banking and corporate stuff more open, more transparent. The goal was, I think, to rebuild trust and to prevent this from happening again.
Sounds like they were serious about learning from their mistakes. Did it work, though? Did they manage to avoid another crisis down the road?
It's hard to say for sure, right? But these reforms, they definitely made a difference. The economies that actually embraced the changes, they bounced back stronger. They learned that slow and steady is better than, growing super fast, but in a risky way.
Right, like they learned to walk before they tried to run a marathon. But this wasn't just an Asian problem, was it? The essay, it argues that this whole thing had global consequences.
Absolutely. The Asian financial crisis, it showed everyone just how connected the global economy really is. Something goes wrong on one side of the world, and it can quickly spread everywhere. And it especially had a big impact on how the IMF does things.
So how did the IMF change after all this? What were the lessons learned?
Well, let's just say the IMF, they got a lot of heat, a lot of criticism for how they handled things, especially those austerity measures. The essay points out that this led to some soul-searching within the IMF, and they shifted their approach.
So what kind of changes are we talking about? What did they do differently?
They started paying more attention to social safety nets. They realized that these austerity measures, they could really hurt vulnerable people.
So they started thinking more about the human cost of these big financial decisions.
Exactly. The IMF, they started to take into account those social and political factors when responding to a crisis. It wasn't just about the numbers anymore.
Wow. It really sounds like the Asian financial crisis, it wasn't just a wake-up call for Asia, it was a wake-up call for the entire world.
Yeah, no doubt. It forced governments, financial institutions, everyone to really rethink their assumptions and their policies and how much risk there really is in this globalized world.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about what caused the Asian financial crisis, the IMF stepping in, the whole recovery process. What's the big takeaway for our listener? What can we learn from this whole thing, even now?
This deep dive, it really drives home the point that our world, it's interconnected in so many ways, especially when you're talking about money, about finance. It's like 1 minute the Thai baht is having a bad day, the next, the whole world is feeling it.
Yeah, it's kind of scary when you think about it like that, right? We're all part of this system, and we don't always know what's going to happen. And the essay, it's good because it doesn't let us forget about the people caught in the middle of all this, the human cost of these financial meltdowns.
Absolutely. And that's where things get really thought-provoking. The essay, it asks this question, what if, and I love this, what if, knowing what we know now, things had gone differently?
Oh, okay. Give me an example. What if? What could have done differently?
Well, let's say, just as for instance, what if before the crisis hit, there was way more focus on lending money responsibly? Or what if the IMF, when they came in, what if they had made sure to protect people, to put those safety nets in place so that when austerity measures hit, it wasn't so brutal for everyday people?
Man, it's hard not to think about that stuff, hindsight's 20/20, right? But if we learn from history, maybe, just maybe, we can make better choices now.
Exactly. That's the hope, right? And the Asian financial crisis, even though it was this awful thing to go through, it does give us these valuable lessons about how fragile things can be, about the downsides of globalization, and about just how tricky it is to intervene in these situations.
It really makes you realize that there are always choices, even when things seem impossible. And those choices, they matter.
Wow. So, listeners, I guess the big takeaway from this deep dive into the Asian financial crisis is to really pay attention. Don't just look at the surface, try to understand how everything's connected, and never forget about the human cost when it comes to these big economic decisions.
Because sometimes even the smallest tremor can cause the biggest earthquake.
That's a great way to put it. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. And until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep exploring this crazy complex world we live in.